Now to discuss the third and final week of the Synod on the Family, what has been accomplished and what it really means to you. I'm joined from Rome by the Papal Posse, Robert Royal, the editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, and Father Gerald Murray of the Archdiocese of New York. Thank you both for being here. Now, before we delve into last week, the other day, these small groups, there were 13 of small groups meeting at this Synod, and they released their reports. What did these reports tell us about the support among the bishops for that Casper proposal, that penitential process that would allow divorced and remarried Catholics to return to the sacrament without an annulment? Robert Royal.
Well, Raymond, there are different ways of parsing what the 13 different groups did. In fact, we even disagree. We sat down the other day over lunch and tried to figure out how to sort them out. And, you could nuance it one way or another. But basically, here's the way it works out, I think. You have about 3 or 4 of the 13 small language circles that in one way or another would like to affirm some path toward communion for the divorced and the remarried. But that's only 13 or 14 out of 3 or 4 out of 13. There probably is a group of about 4 or 5 who have said absolutely no, or you can see that they're leaning in that direction, but didn't pronounce in the actual report they submitted to the committee that's drafting the document. The biggest worry here might be the other 5 or so groups who talk about either devolving the authority to make decisions about this matter to a local level, either to a bishops' conference or to bishops themselves, or to move it to the Holy Father. So if that process continues, then we don't get closure. But for right now, inside the Synod, it seems to be universally acknowledged that the Casper proposal is not going to move forward.
Okay. At a press conference...
I would add to that, Raymond, that it was interesting to see... No, it was interesting to see that the English language groups, by and large, were against the Casper proposal, and one of the French groups, the one involving Cardinal Sarah, was clearly against it. So there is a kind of breakdown that goes the English and French-speaking worlds against it, Italian, Spanish, and German showing either favor or tolerance for the Casper proposal.
At a press conference Wednesday, German Cardinal Reinhard Marx, who has previously said that local churches should not be seen as a subsidiary of Rome and vowed to go their own way on certain hot-button issues, he had this to say about how this synod will end. Gentlemen, listen.
The Holy Father will make something with this text, so the synod is not at the end. The Synod opens the way for the Holy Father to do what he wants with this discussions.
The Synod is now going to end, but that will not be the end. Where do you see this continuing? Clearly, we have said from the start, the Pope will have the last word. But it seems there's a strategy being advanced here to keep these issues that perhaps lacked support alive. What do you think?
Well, Raymond, it's a bit hard. We're outside the room, and we don't know exactly what's going on inside. But one of the themes, of course, that has emerged over the last, in particular over the last week and a half, is that the possibilities that the Holy Father is going to have open to him, the Vatican has been emphasizing that a great deal. I think we've talked about that before on this program. And the worrisome thing about this is if you believe that the Holy Father really does want to advance the Casper proposal, and you have those 3 or so small groups that want to affirm it, and maybe 4 or 5 that would like to move a decision on that to bishops' conferences or the Pope himself, that may just mean that we get after 2 years of working on this, we get some sort of commission or a special decision on the part of the Holy Father, which really could deliver us the Casper proposal, but not through the mechanism of the Synod itself. So if it goes on, it's one thing if what Cardinal Marx is talking about is that synodality, as the Holy Father said last Saturday when he was celebrating the 50 years of the modern Synod. If what that means is we're going to listen and discuss among ourselves more broadly, more widely, that, of course, is something the Church ought to be doing anyway and has done in the past. Yeah. If it means that we're now going to have an absolutely open process that has no limit, then it's another matter.
Archbishop Mark Coleridge of Brisbane had this to say at Monday's press conference about the consensus at this synod.
I don't think we're ever going to get consensus on some of these hot-button issues. But was that ever a realistic possibility? I doubt it. And the one thing that's certain about next Sunday is that we won't have finished the task. This journey will continue.
Father Jerry, how will this journey continue? What form might it take? Bob just mentioned this special commission that might explore hot-button issues. Might this new dicastery that the Pope announced today, this new dicastery on the family, might that be the commission that some of these small groups desired and some of the bishops desired?
Well, it's not clear exactly what's going to happen today. The final report draft was handed to the Synod Fathers. It was not made public, and it's a confidential document, so we haven't seen it. And that will tell the tale, because in it, the Synod Writing Committee is basically giving to the Fathers what they want them to approve. The Fathers will have an opportunity tomorrow to both debate it on the floor and to submit written amendments. If this notion that the Synod is not going to continue, or is not going to rather reach a final decision on the so-called hot-button issues, which, by the way, let me remind our listeners, we're talking about something that has been the constant practice of the Catholic Church since it was founded. Giving communion to people who are in an adulterous second marriage has never been the position of the Church. So if that decision is not reached by the Synod, and if the clear teaching of the Church and its discipline is not upheld, but rather is postponed and given into the hands of a commission, that would be a rather frustrating end, in my opinion, because the Synod Fathers have been looking at this material for now a year and a half, almost 2 years. It's quite clear. There is no theological support for this notion, and it would be worrisome. One of the things we're hearing is the Synod may talk about conscience in a new way, which would more or less be a backdoor way of saying the Catholic Church is going to leave it to people to decide what they want to do. Conscience is a profoundly important notion in the Church, but it does not equal do whatever you want. And that really, I hope, doesn't come out of this Synod.
Yeah, we heard certain archbishops, Archbishop Supich of Chicago, say that conscience is preeminent, or it should be. Before I launch into some of these specific ideas advanced this week by certain Synod Fathers, and where that leaves us, there has been a noticeable omission in all of these discussions, mainly children. Now, Father Murray, you wrote an amazing piece this week underscoring this absence of kids. What is the problem here, Father? Why not talk about children in the context of family?
Well, you know, the Synod really got its start with Cardinal Casper's report to the cardinals in Rome a year and a half ago, in which he highlighted this notion of communion for divorced and remarried. And I think that kind of hijacked the whole impetus of what the Synod's supposed to be about. Family is the strength of the Catholic Church and is the basis of society. I'm a parish priest. I have a wonderful parish in Manhattan. We have a big CCD program, many families coming. That's the life of the Church, and we should not be focusing simply on ancillary questions which are based sometimes on bad theology. You know, all this focus on difficulties and helping people in problems, that's all fine, but you can only get to that point if we first say, God has a plan. It's been revealed to us, Adam and Eve, Christ, sacrament of marriage. Family is the basis of how the Church progresses in society. That should have been highlighted. In fact, children really are absent subjects at this Synod, and it is a mistake, I think.
Yeah.
And one of the things that many of the Synod Fathers have talked about is that, unfortunately, because of the focus on these so-called hot-button issues, what the Synod then begins to look like is just a debate over certain points, when in fact there was an opportunity here to talk about supporting and actually developing inside the Church the means to support good, sound families. And Cardinal Napier from South Africa said the other day that if we really want a touchstone for how the Synod should proceed, we should look at that first, those good families, and say that's what we want and how do we get people to that. Instead, what we've got is, I think we will end up with a document that will not incorporate these departures, as Father says, from the classic understandings that exist in the Church. We don't know where the process will go after that, but it's become an internal process more than really a conversation. And it's ironic that this synod was supposed to be opened up to conversation, and it's ended up being a debate over some points that certain people in the West, not even everyone in the West, seem to think are burning issues.
There's also been this constant emphasis, we've heard this week after week throughout the synod, of changing or adapting language the church uses to discuss and define certain situations. This is Archbishop Mark Coleridge of Brisbane again. Here he is at Monday's press conference. Now, he suggested that certain language is too broad, like the word adultery. Listen.
It's just to say that every second marriage or second union, whatever you want to call it, is adulterous, is perhaps too sweeping. For instance, a second marriage that is enduring and stable and loving and where there are children who are cared for is not the same as a couple skulking off to a hotel room for a wicked weekend.
Can that language change in the church, Father Murray?
I really regret that the Archbishop said that. He's not, unfortunately, the first to say it. Cardinal Casper also said something similar more than a year ago. Let's get down to hard brass tacks here. Jesus Christ said if a man leaves his wife, divorces his wife and marries another, he commits adultery. You can't dismiss that, get around it, say, well, if the circumstance of the adultery kind of imitate a marriage that's valid, well, we won't call it adultery. Now, let's get to another problem here, Raymond, which is language. Language is meant to convey clearly meaning and information. Jesus was quite clear. Marriage is one man, one woman for life. So if you leave your wife or you leave your husband, that's regrettable, but the church can deal with that and say, look, don't enter an invalid second marriage. If you do enter an invalid second marriage, the message of the church is clear. Stop the adultery. If you have children, you need to be responsible and raise them. Fine, live as brother and sister. There are many heroic couples doing that. God's grace is ample. We should not say that the Lord was too strict when he said adultery applies to all cases of people having a second wife or a second husband. That, for me, that's basic Catholicism.
Raymond, we've also seen inside the press briefings questions put several times to the presenters at those briefings. Well, you've had weeks and weeks and, almost a year and a half, more than a year and a half now, talking about language. Can you give us some examples of what new language we would be able to use about adulterous second marriages, as Father just said, or about issues like homosexuality as intrinsically disordered? After all this time, and after all these people meeting together in goodwill, trying to find some other way to present the solid teachings of the Church, no one has been able to offer a single example of a different kind of language because there isn't any. These terms that we've used are not offensive unless you choose to be offended by them. They express what Catholic moral teaching is. Of course, we're kind to human beings. We have to love other human beings no matter what circumstances they're in. But this is really a dodge. There is no language that is going to satisfy people who are going to want their own situations to be affirmed. And that's proven by the fact that no one up to this point has been able to offer an alternative for any of these allegedly offensive ways of speaking about things.
Yeah, I also thought that the Archbishop's examples there were a little unfortunate. I mean, to say that a stable union where people are married without an annulment is somehow more moral than the overnight tryst at the motel. Frankly, the overnight tryst at the motel, you can go get forgiveness and you're done. The adultery stops. In the other case, it continues, does it not?
Yes, in fact, that's one of the things that we warn people against, which is to develop a habit of sin, and that to try and convince yourself, since you feel comfortable in your sin or you find this new relationship agreeable, that somehow it's not displeasing to God. I think of the analogy to Alcoholics Anonymous. At AA, you announce yourself as saying, I'm an alcoholic. They don't flee from the language of truth. And I think, as a pastor, I don't go walk up to people and say, you're an adulterer, stop your behavior. But if people come in to talk to me about their problem with a second marriage, I say, look, if you want to get right with the church, either see if there was a reason why your first marriage was null, and if there's not, live as brother and sister, because what counts in the end? Do I please myself or do I please God? I think we all know the answer to that. Please God, then your life will be in order.
I want to share this with you. This is, again, Cardinal Reinhard Marx. He had this to say about church doctrine and truth on Wednesday. Listen to this closely.
The doctrine is the tradition of the church. The doctrine of the church is not a closed shop, but a living tradition. We don't change the truth, but we find the greater truth. We are not, the truth is owning us. We don't own the truth. The truth is a person we meet.
Your thoughts on this? How is truth a person we meet? Robert Royal.
Well, look, in one way, of course, Jesus himself says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and we should take that literally. And if we're going to make advances in doctrine, it should be more deeply into those things that our Lord himself has told us. I was there in the room when he said that, and it just struck me that it's true that there are all sorts of levels of doctrine and different shadings and applications and whatnot, but the fact still stands that over 2,000 years of Catholic history, in which our tradition has been developed by some very holy and some very smart people in all sorts of different circumstances. No one has ever pointed to the complexity and richness of Catholic theology and said that that's some sort of justification to ignore our Lord's words about marriage and divorce. So, you know, it's true in an abstract theological sense, but it has almost no relevance to the things we're discussing.
This is like people at the Supreme Court of the United States saying we have a living constitution, which we constantly rewrite when we come across new pressure groups telling us what the liberal agenda is. The Constitution is written down. We know what it means. Well, Catholic doctrine is even much more certain because it comes from God. So this notion that, you know, truth will vary according to the situation, we're falling into basically the heresy of Gnosticism, where kind of the real meaning of Christianity is unknown until someone comes along and tells us. No, it's quite clear. The Church teaches, the teaching is known, now we have to live that teaching.
I want to take the wide view for the moment before we run out of time. Who, in your opinion, shaped this synod in the most preeminent way? Who are the breakout players here?
Well, in the first instance, it seems to me that the drafters of the working document gave the bishops who arrived here a very difficult task, because it's a very complicated, disjointed, not very inspiring text on a subject that really should have been something that would be uplifting and point a way toward being uplifting, not only for the Synod Fathers, but for people back home. So the writers of that document, the drafters of that document, had the greatest influence beyond compare. Inside the room this time around, clearly Cardinal Pell from Australia, who's the head of this new economic dicastery here in the Vatican, has been a tremendous spokesman, along with the others who signed the letter that he prepared. He's been a tremendous spokesman, warning everyone and warning the Holy Father that there seem to be dangers lurking down the way. So I think that he's played a pivotal role in making sure that as much as you could get out of a bad document like this, which is to say, it couldn't realistically be very good or be very inspiring, but at least it's not going to have those profound departures from Catholicity. I mean, we were facing at one point with the very conservative Polish delegation and the very liberal German delegation that a person on one side or the other of the border could drive across the border and either be committing a profound sacrilege or being the recipient of a profound act of mercy, according to the Casper program or the devolution program. It's a mess, and it's probably the worst has been avoided, but this is not an ideal thing for the Church to present to the world as a way to help reinforce the family.
Father Jerry, who in your opinion?
Well, let me say, I think the methodology and the process, meaning the way the whole thing was structured, this evening here in Rome, the Synod Fathers received the document only in Italian. The draft of the final document was only given in Italian. They have tonight to read it, and then tomorrow to make comments both on the floor and in written form. And for me, that really is lacking. This synod has been in preparation for over a year. There are 5 language groups. Couldn't that document be produced in the language group so that people could read it? Because right now, I think many cardinals who don't know Italian, and they don't have an Italian translator with them, they don't know what that document says in the end. And I think that's really a fault. I would say that Bob's point is absolutely correct. Cardinal Pell, I would add Cardinal Sarah's had a great influence. A lot of behind-the-scenes things, of course, that we don't know about.
Right.
But from the public relations point of view, the message, I think, is quite clear. The defenders of Catholic tradition and teaching were not silent, and they came really to the forefront to say we cannot change what is unchangeable.
Well, I would say one of the most important interjections in the midst of this synodal process was Pope Francis himself in another defining speech of his papacy. During the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the establishment of these synods, Pope Francis discussed the need to decentralize the church, decentralize power. He said this, in a synodal church, as I have said, it is not advisable for the Pope to take the place of local bishops in the discernment of every issue which arises in their territory. In this sense, I am conscious of the need to promote a sound decentralization. He added that the church should be a synodal church, one that listens. What does that mean, this decentralization? And how does this square with his annulment reforms passed last year with no consultation at all, or earlier this year?
Well, let me jump in on that, Raymond, and say the Pope is right in a very real sense that the church cannot be micromanaged from Rome. Bishops in the nations and bishops in their dioceses are responsible. On the other hand, and I think the Pope realized it because precisely his actions also signal that we can just decentralize everything. Take the sexual abuse by clergy. When Rome was not actively supervising what was going on in many countries, disasters were happening. This Pope has established this commission for sexual abuse. He gave new rules. He established a tribunal so that bishops who are negligent in handling cases will be judged by this commission. You mentioned the annulment rules. Those were not circulated to national bishops' conferences for consultation before they were issued. So, you know, decentralization is good on some things, but, you know, the Catholic Church is one. The Pope confirms the brethren in the faith, and I think we're going to have to continue with that if we want to have a unity of approach and apostolate.
Robert Royal, in the same speech, Pope Francis also talked about a conversion of the papacy. He said, while reaffirming the urgent need to think about a conversion of the papacy, I willingly repeat the words of my predecessor, Pope John Paul II, as Bishop of Rome. I'm fully aware that Christ ardently desires the full and visible communion of all those communities in which, by virtue of God's faithfulness, His Spirit dwells. Now, John Paul II there was talking about Christian unity. What is Pope Francis getting at?
I have to say I don't know, Raymond. And as in that earlier quotation that you mentioned that Father commented on, I don't know who ever thought that Rome micromanaged everything in every diocese. So we're going to have to see what the Holy Father does with that. And you may recall that when John Paul II talked about trying to stimulate greater movement toward Christian unity, he invited others to help him rethink what he called the Petrine ministry, the ministry that St. Peter was given by our Lord to strengthen and to hold together his disciples. So even a converted papacy along the lines that Francis is talking about is going to have to be some sort of sacrament of unity. The only way that I think we'll be able to understand what he means by that and means by a synodal church is as we see the way it develops. At this point, it seems a very general statement.
Yeah, no, it's an odd statement, the conversion of the papacy. I need to wrap here. What was accomplished in the final appraisal? I mean, we have what essentially is a collection of reflections on the family, a pamphlet for the Pope to consider. What does this do in your estimation? Father Gerald Murray, what was accomplished in these 3 weeks?
I think these 3 weeks have been a revelation that there is a crisis in the Church and that there's a lack of unity as regards the sacramental discipline of the Church, and I say that with regret. I thought the Casper proposal was going nowhere. I was distressed to see that it was proposed by some of the small language groups. I hope that it doesn't emerge in the final document. But, you know, in the Catholic Church, it's no surprise if you look at the history that there are some movements within the Church to change church doctrine. This is disconcerting to people, and I think we hope and pray that nothing bad will come of it. But given the fact that there are bishops who are saying these things, it's good for the Catholic people to reaffirm their loyalty, because what St. John Paul II and Pope Benedict taught about the reception of communion by divorced and remarried people, that is Catholic truth and practice. It's not an opinion. It's not a doubtful question. So I regret that that continued to be on the table. On the positive side, I'll say this. We understand even better now with the toxic culture that surrounds us in the U.S. and elsewhere. If we don't strengthen family life, then we're really not doing our job as a church. I think that's what Pope Francis had as his intuition for the Synod, and I pray that the implementation of that will benefit Catholic families throughout the world.
Robert Royal, where do we go from here?
It's a positive thing that at least within the Synod process, we didn't have these horrible departures from Catholic teaching in the document that is going to be, we think, the document that's been produced. It's only been an hour or so here in Rome that the bishops have had that, and we'll have to see tomorrow and then the following day what that document actually contains. But it seems at this point that in that very limited way, the document has been corrected and will not propose things that are contrary to the faith.
Well,
however, in the longer run, as his father was saying, we now have this mentality that the Catholic Church is discussing things like communion for the divorced and remarried, is discussing things like what stance we have toward homosexuals, although that subject, which was a burning subject last time, seems to have dropped away this time around. I think it was just too much to try to deal with all those things in this one event. The difficulty is that it sends out a message to a lot of people. I hear this from priests, I hear this from laity, that they don't know anymore where is the church going. They're very confused about what the church stands for. That was already the case because we've had a number of decades of rather poor catechetics of our own people, and I think it's probably even worse. But I think Father is right that the positive side of this is many of the bishops in the Synod have talked about the importance of the family, not only to the future life of the church, but to the future life of society in this world. So we're at a crisis point. It's been recognized. Let's hope that the Holy Spirit leads us in the direction that we're called to go at this point in history.
Well, I said it last year. I said it during the papal visit. I said it as we started the coverage of this Synod. All of this is just preamble. The Holy Father will have the last word. I think he means to do something and will do it in this year of mercy, which commences in December. We'll, of course, stay on top of this and continue watching. Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, thank you for joining us for these past 3 weeks, and, of course, for the great papal visits. Couldn't have done it without you all. Be sure to